Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We continue our discussion here of the market economy that evolves from roughly the 1820s through the 1860s. And in this discussion, we're going to continue thinking about that and talk about a number of inventions and technology that shifted things during that era. And we'll also talk about the evolution of the factory economy with a particular focus on the Lowell Mills in Massachusetts. Just as changes in transportation, like canals and railroads, led to innovations in that realm and much quicker travel and transport of items, improvements in various technologies also made the spread of information much quicker during this time. Now, I noted in a few previous lectures how slow news traveled in the early colonial era and the days of the Revolution. We think about things like George Washington and how it took several days and even weeks for him to receive word that he had been elected as the first president and make his way to New York. And so information traveling much more quickly revolutionized the way things operated in this country. So one important invention, of course it comes along a little bit later in our period, is the telegraph, introduced in 1844 by inventor Samuel Morse. And the ability then to spread news almost instantaneously is just going to revolutionize the way our country thinks about various things. And we'll talk about other examples of this as we go forward. There comes to be a heightened sense of unity in the nation as we are all hearing about things within moments of each other. Prior to an invention like the telegraph, it could take weeks or even months for news of a certain event to reach other parts of the country. Again, we think about something like the end of the War of 1812, when the Battle of New Orleans was fought even after peace had been declared and the war was over, but no one on this side of the Atlantic Ocean knew about that. Improvements in technologies related to printing allowed for a proliferation of newspapers, magazines, and books. By 1835, there were some 1,200 newspapers in circulation in this country. There were many other magazines as well, and you start to see specific and tailored magazines for particular audiences that are interested in reading and seeing about just one particular thing or another. And similarly, book publishing in the country became much more prolific in the years from the 1820s to the 1840s. As a final thought in this vein, and again, we may not think about it so much today, but the proliferation of prints was becoming much more common in this era, and particularly those done by Currier and Ives, who printed colorful pictures of all kinds of things, typically focused on patriotic themes and holidays and celebrations, but also new inventions, new technologies, and in some cases even disasters like steamboat crashes or railroad crashes, or even notorious crimes were pictured in their prints. But people all across the country were now able to see, while they might strike us as sort of primitive, but they could see full color pictures and prints of things that were happening all over the country and all over the world. Now, the kinds of inventions and technologies we've been talking about also crept into the realm of production. And in this era of the 1820s and 30s, we're going to see another aspect of the market revolution, which today we would describe as industrialization, the increasing introduction of factories where products were produced at scale for sale all over the country and all over the world. This is going to have a dramatic impact, particularly on the population in the country that we might call artisans. Prior to the introduction of factories, mass production, and this market economy, a lot of goods were produced by skilled artisans. So you might think about a cabinet maker or a clock maker, a furniture builder, a shoemaker. All of these would have been particularly skilled people. They typically trained for many, many years to perfect their practice, and they would produce these one-of-a-kind, very special items to be sold at the marketplace. Now, this also meant that many of those goods were consumed only by the wealthy and the upper classes. Again, you might think about some very fine pieces of antique furniture that you've probably seen in pictures or maybe in your own experience. As we move more to a factory economy, where we're thinking about producing replicated products exactly the same over and over again, those goods are able to be produced much more quickly and efficiently and cheaply, and so they are more widely available to consumers. But it also begins to push to the margins the skills and abilities of those skilled artisans, many of whom find themselves either out of work or hard-pressed to make a good living, or forced to accept work along the factory line where their particular skills would simply not be of any particular use anymore. Factory life also led to shifts in just the way we thought about our lives and productivity. Artisans often worked out of their own homes, or they might have a little workshop attached to the home, whereas factories would typically be located away from one person's home. We're going to talk about mills and mill villages in just a minute, but it often meant a bit of a commute, a bit of a walk to get to work, and so you were no longer just constantly around your own home and working within that small network. This also had an impact at times on women who found themselves called into the workforce in one way or another. In just a moment, we're going to talk about Lowell girls, girls and women who actually worked in the mills and worked in the factories. But many other women performed tasks at home through a process which was called outwork, where various industries might send certain parts of the work process to women who could work in their homes doing some of the preliminary work, and then those goods would be sent back to the factory to be finished. In any case, more and more women during this era are finding themselves employed, making money, contributing to the home economy. Eventually, that's going to trickle over into movements for increasing rights and representation for women, which we're going to be talking about in future lectures. Now, of course, not everything associated with this shift is positive. There's a new experience for many Americans that, to those of us today, is very common and routine. But what does it mean to be an employee? What does it mean to be working for someone else? Again, prior to this era, most Americans worked essentially for their own sustenance. They worked according to their own rhythms and were their own bosses. Now they are employees. They are working under someone else's terms. We also see just a shift in the day-to-day activity of life. More and more Americans are not governed by the rising and setting of the sun or the shifting of seasons. It comes to be the factory whistle that governs people's lives. And many Americans find this troubling. There are actually comparisons between that situation and slavery. No longer are you in charge of your own life, but you are working for someone else on projects on their terms. Despite these potential drawbacks, more and more Americans are finding themselves drawn into the life in the factories and in the mills, as more and more companies and businesses are finding them to be efficient and very profitable ways of making a living. In 1814, we see one of the first major efforts at this, introduced in Waltham, Massachusetts, the Waltham system or Waltham experiment, in which a factory was surrounded by homes and other necessary places, creating what we call a mill town. So the workforce lived close to the factory and got all of their needs met within the universe of that mill town. In 1823, that same group produced an even more expansive mill village called the Lowell Mills. And much of what was done in those mills was accomplished by young girls and women who came to be known as the Lowell girls. It was not uncommon for children and women, in this cases young girls, to be employed in factories because they could be had for cheaper wages than grown men. And in many cases, conditions within the factories and mills were miserable. And that was certainly the case in the Lowell Mills, although the expectations of that day are far different than they are now in terms of limiting hours, working conditions, safety considerations, and so on. So why did these mill girls subject themselves to working in the mills? Well, because they needed to, or at least they thought they needed to, in order to make a living. Consider the words of one of the girls who wrote a letter home saying, "There are girls here for every reason and for no reason at all. I will speak to you of my acquaintances in the family here. One that sits to my right hand at table is in the factory because she hates her mother-in-law. She has a kind father and an otherwise excellent home, but as she and her mamma agree about as well as cat and mouse, she has come to the factory. The one next to her has a wealthy father, but like many of our country farmers, he's very penurious and wishes his daughters to maintain themselves. The next is here because there is no better place for her. The next has a well-off mother, but she is a very pious woman. The next is here because her parents and family are wicked infidels. The next because she must labor somewhere." And on and on. So the girls worked for all kinds of reasons. They also worked in very difficult conditions, sometimes harsh and, to our modern mindset, beyond imagination. The same girl writes of her working conditions, "How hard it will seem to be boxed up 14 hours a day among a parcel of clattering looms and whirling spindles whose constant din is enough to drive a girl out of her wits." So we see the price of industrialization and factories. They are able to provide goods and services much more cheaply and widely available to many American consumers. But the price comes for those who are working in the mills under these kind of very difficult and harsh conditions. And we'll talk in the future that at times workers do begin to organize and sometimes launch strikes, although we're still very early in that process. But for the most part, working conditions in factories in the era we're talking about here were very difficult and often led to harsh living conditions, illness, disease, and sometimes even death.